Okay, I think that's everything all right then. So we'll start. There's a Q&A you can see at the top. If anyone wants to write any questions, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll have interpretation also in Spanish, which you should be able to access. I think it's at the top right of your screen. And we'll start off with some introductory remarks from MEP Malin Bjork. So please, Malin, take the floor, and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here with us online today. This is for us a very important step in the work of the Left Group in the European Parliament, and also together with lots of civil society organizations and researchers that are trying to put this on the agenda. And just to a little bit frame our work on issues of both climate justice and climate policies on the one hand, and the issue of militarization and the current arms race that we actually see. So as the Left Group, we are a very strong actor in the work on against climate change and on the issue of climate justice in the European Parliament. We have a full program on that, and we work very strongly to now see that we have policies in place for addressing the most pressing global security issue we have at hand, the climate change. So we will see initiatives now at EU level, a new climate law. We will see a set of legislations will be coming forward under the Green New Deal, as many of you have heard of. However, our view is that there is a lack of coherence between different policy fields in the EU. We have looked at agricultural policy, and that is just not up to the board. We have looked at the macroeconomic policies that are not also directing money towards addressing climate change. And we wanted also to look at the military sector. And it is also something that has been very difficult because, as many of you will know, is that it's like a black hole. You pour money into it, but you don't actually know where it really goes. And the same thing when you try to understand what is going on there in terms of carbon footprint and its impact on climate and environment. We don't have enough information. This is our first step. And also the left in Europe, we have a very clear agenda also in terms of trying to address what we see as a lack in the global security paradigm that we see today. The last, let's say, 5 years have seen an arms race. And I would say a very worrying shift towards militarized solutions to security problems. And that in itself, for us in the left, is the wrong way to go. So we try to combine our different perspectives. We are very concerned with global security. We are very concerned about people's well-being and to address the issues that we are facing. But we think that the current arms race and the militarization, and even the military industry's role in that, has to be increasingly addressed. And we also have to choose other paths to human security. So with that short introduction on the different perspectives that we have, we are so happy to have this first report. We will have a chance to hear from the researchers that have produced this report, where they look at a number of countries and the carbon footprints of the military activities of those countries. And you will be able to tell us a little bit what you could find, what you couldn't find, and the conclusions that you make from this attempt. And I would also like to say already here in the beginning, this is a start of something. This is a start of something, and it is certainly not the end. My own country, Sweden, is not part of the study yet, but we hope to be able to bring more countries into this let's say, spotlight of carbon footprints of the military. So with those words, a warm welcome to our guests, to our researchers, to the ones that have been able to produce this report for the Left Group. I have here, and in the order here, it's first Lindsay Cottrell, Environmental Policy Officer at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. And I will first give you the floor, and then after to our colleague Stuart Parkinson. So please, Lindsay, 10 minutes presentation.
Thank you very much for the introductions, Malin. So I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see that fine? Okay, so hello everyone. So I'm Lindsay Cottrell from the Conflict and Environment Observatory. We're a small UK charity and we work with a range of stakeholders to raise awareness about environmental damage caused from conflict and from military activity. And we collect environmental data, do research and scrutinise law and policy to increase protection for people and the environment. So in the next few minutes, I just want to run through the objectives of the study that we did on behalf of the Left Group in the European Parliament, briefly go through some of the overarching initiatives and policies, the transparency of the data and the some of the existing reports. Then I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to explain a bit more about the methodology that we use to estimate the carbon footprint, the estimates themselves and key recommendations from the study and some of the barriers in achieving these. So from a military perspective, there's already recognition that climate change is a threat to European and wider global security. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It increases the risk of conflict, such as through natural resource management, forces migration, and the impacts land use and agriculture. In 2018, the World Bank warned that by 2050, 140 million people could be forced to migrate due to climate change. With the European Green Deal, there's hope for broad consensus regarding sustainability targets, and all sectors will be under much greater scrutiny to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The military have been much slower to adapt in spite of their high energy consumption and high expenditure. The EU's armed forces are one of the largest energy consumers among government actors. So with the EU being a dependent on fossil fuel imports and the military's high energy demands, this makes energy security for the military very critical. And in the battlefields, the energy supply is a logistical challenge as well. So we're seeing that energy security and energy resilience is the main catalyst behind most of the initiatives for driving military adoption of energy efficiencies and low carbon options. So of the 27 EU countries, no doubt you're aware, 21 are also in NATO. NATO members have agreed to a minimum spending of 2% of GDP on the military. And this commitment to increase spending, of course, risks increasing greenhouse gas emissions. NATO's Secretary General has acknowledged that NATO and armed forces do need to contribute to reach net zero carbon emissions. And to do this, NATO members must calculate their carbon outputs and also report on these figures. So CEOBS and the Scientists for Global Responsibility, we were commissioned in October 2020, so it's a pretty short time frame. And we undertook a very broad analysis of the carbon footprint of the EU military, by which we mean both national armed forces and the military technology industries based in the EU. So we looked at carbon footprint only, so we're not looking at the much wider environmental impacts from military, for example, from military use of equipment, munitions, end-of-life disposal, chemical use, exemptions through REACH legislation, for example, or land quality on military estates. We didn't look at any of that. Carbon footprints were based on estimates of available data. So we do think that they're very conservative and we suspect the true figures will be much higher. What we also didn't cover was greenhouse gas emissions from the battlefield, for example. If a fuel depot was destroyed, or emissions related with post-conflict reconstruction requirements, and that would have to undergo a separate examination. So as Marlon said, this is an initial assessment and it is just a starting point. So in terms of the scope, we focused on the top 6 EU countries with respect to military expenditure. So as you can see, this was France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland and Spain. And by far, France and Germany, as you can see, are the biggest spenders. We also examined overarching policies and initiatives which are in the public domain, which are aimed at reducing military greenhouse gas emissions, and we try to gauge their effectiveness. So with regards to the European Green Deal, this sets out an action plan to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the proposed European climate law will obviously set this commitment into a legal obligation. And there's a recognition that action is needed across all sectors, and logically this should also include the military. So at the moment, the European Environment Agency annual reporting, which looks at trends and projections on national data for greenhouse gas emissions and renewables and energy consumption. But this doesn't list the military as a specific sector under this reporting, so that which at the moment is pretty unfortunate. There are a host of initiatives and working groups in place already, and I'm just going to run through some of these for you, but not all of them. NATO, for example, there's the Energy Security Centre of Excellence, which was set up in 2012. There's a Green Defence Framework, which was adopted in 2014, which set out to improve energy efficiency and resource use. In 2015, there was a smart energy review of military energy use and approaches to reducing energy consumption. And back in 2015, this found pretty low levels of engagement across NATO members. And there was a number of recommendations, one of which was developing the smart energy, incorporating that into one of the NATO working group structures. In terms of the European Defence Agency, which all EU members except Denmark are part, there's the European Defence Energy Network, which aims to link stakeholders into adopting low carbon energy. There's the Consultation Forum for Sustainable Energy in Defence and Security Sector, and this sets out to share information and best practice on energy efficiency and building performance and adopting renewals. Then there's the EDA Energy and Environment Working Group, which was established in 2014. And then there's the DEFNet, which is an informal group of environmental specialists from EU defence ministries. So these overarching policies initiatives are setting out to improve energy efficiency and adopt renewable energy solutions to benefit military operational resilience. But what's in the public domain, there's no evidence of military strategy or focus or adjustment of military spending which is required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I would say the correct approach to greenhouse gas emission reduction is not about doing the same things differently. It's about first taking the step and making that decision whether it should be done in the first place. So although these initiatives may be in place and ongoing, how can their effectiveness be gauged without energy targets or full reporting being in place or published? So all these initiatives should mean there's an opportunity for cooperation and change across the EU, but there is an absence of full carbon reporting and carbon management by the military. Carbon reporting is a passive process, but if emissions aren't measured, how can it be effectively managed? From carbon reporting comes carbon management, and this is an active process, and this is what you need to make the right decisions, policies, strategies, etc. So all EU members are party to the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, and under that they're obliged to publish annual greenhouse gas emission inventories. But the lack of military reporting probably it stems from the operating rules to implement the Kyoto Protocol, which excludes greenhouse gas emissions or targets required for military activities. And under the Paris Agreement, cutting military emissions is discretionary. So this means that military emissions to the UN Unfccc submissions is also voluntary. Only Germany, Slovakia and Cyprus appear to be submitting complete UN Unfccc military data. And the data we found was available. In part, there were gaps in it and there was poor quality, which means that no one's actually knowing whether the military carbon emissions are falling or not, especially if you're looking at military spending increasing. So that's my introduction, and now I'm going to hand over to Stuart, and you can find out more about SEOB's work through the usual channels.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you very much for that overview. Now I give the floor to you, Stuart Parkinson, Executive Director at Scientists for Global Responsibility. for your presentations. 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you very much to the European United Left for inviting us. I will carry on where Lindsay left off. So looking at the broader issue and looking at the data in more detail and presenting you with some of the data. Just a quick bit of background about Scientists for Global Responsibility. We're a research and advocacy organisation based in the UK, and we have about 600 scientists and engineers as members. And we draw on their expertise for the areas that we work. We've worked on climate change and militarism in science and technology as two of our key areas of concern for about 30 years now. So yeah, we've looked at these issues for a long time. We've been working particularly, we've done small pieces of work around military carbon emissions for the last 15 years, and we've been encountered so many problems of poor data, and it's such an issue to actually discuss the issue. In 2020, last year, we did manage to get enough funding and data together to produce a report on the UK. And I'll look at some of those figures in comparison with our latest report in a little while. So, yeah, so I'll start here by going into a bit more of the methodology and the data that we used, and then go into some results. So the main data sources we looked at what countries submit to the Unfccc as part of their official national carbon emissions reporting process through the national inventories that they produce and what data they revealed through that. Where that data was incomplete, which as Lindsay said was most countries, we then looked at Defence Ministry reports to see if they were reporting at national level. We also looked at corporate annual reports in the military technology sector and other military suppliers where possible. And then we looked at a range of academic and other non-governmental organisations' analyses of military industrial sectors in comparable nations. So the two nations where we did have data that was usable and comparable was the UK and Norway. So I'll come to those in a minute. The analysis we did, we were able to get some data across the EU, not country specific, so across the EU, so that was useful. And then we looked in more detail at 6 case study nations, as Lindsay mentioned, the largest military spenders in the EU, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, and the Netherlands. Within each country, we looked at the carbon emissions related to the military industrial sectors. So to use the jargon, we looked at scope 1 and 2 emissions. So scope 1 emissions is direct emissions from a building or a vehicle that an organization owns. So for the military, this would be a military base or a or aircraft, fighter aircraft, warships, tanks, etc. So direct emissions, direct carbon emissions from those vehicles or buildings. And scope 2 emissions is where the energy use is off-site. So it's electricity consumption. You'd count the emissions of the electricity consumption at the power station. So we looked at those emissions for the armed forces, military technology companies, and a little bit of data from supply chain within the countries. So we came up with a whole bunch of estimates on those countries, and they're in detail in the report. And then we tried to look at carbon footprints for the whole sector for the countries. So the carbon footprint of military spending, we used the direct data from the military emissions, scope 1 and 2 emissions from the armed forces. And then we looked at, we used a life cycle assessment study that had been carried out on the Norwegian military, which as far as we know is the first one that has been carried out 2 years ago, I think now. So we used some of the guiding analysis and extrapolated from that data. We're going to say this a lot in these two presentations. Poor data quality was a big problem, and that in itself is a crucial issue. If you can't measure it, if you're not measuring it, how can you tell whether you're improving it? In some cases, data was not collected. In some cases, it was complete data that was collected. Some cases you couldn't tell whether it was complete data because of the lack of transparency over that data. Now, some countries use national security restrictions to restrict access to the data. Some companies use commercial confidentiality restrictions. All of it made it far more difficult, and all of it we submit is unjustified. The amount of data that EU militaries and most militaries across the world release into the public domain is far greater than and far more sensitive than the environmental data that would be needed to monitor the activities of the militaries in terms of their carbon emissions. So we need this data in the open, and there is no real excuse for it not to be. And the sector, as Lindsay said, the sector is plagued by problems of unclear international reporting standards. So the Kyoto Protocol is the historic problem here. Because of US lobbying in 1997, this sector was excluded from not only from emissions targets, but also from reporting. And so the military sectors have not caught up. Some countries are better than others, but there's a long way to go. So therefore, our estimates are very conservative. We've used the data that's available, but there's probably more data out there that we think will show that the real figures are significantly higher. So here's the first estimate to show you. So this is the estimated carbon footprint of all the militaries in the EU. So this is military spending in the EU from the 27 countries. The blue area of the graph is the military emissions as reported to the Unfccc. You can see that's about 20% of the carbon footprint, a small proportion. And the rest, the other 20 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, that was either indirect emissions, so that could be the military industrial sector itself, military technology companies that make the weapons, other suppliers. It could be misreported emissions, so that was often military base energy consumption, which was often reported within civilian categories. In the reports to the Unfccc, and sometimes it was unreported emissions. So countries not reporting the emissions of their warships, their fighter aircraft, their tanks, not reporting it at all. So that gives you an idea of what the total figure is, or at least a minimum estimate of the total figure, and what proportion is currently identified as military emissions within the Unfccc data. The total figure is the annual equivalent to about the emissions, the direct carbon emissions of about 14 million cars. So it's a sizable sector and it's not being properly reported. So there you go. If we look at the countries in particular, our 6 case study countries, the first thing that's obvious is that we had no clear data on Poland, so we can't even give you an estimate. For France, it was clearly the largest emitting nation, and at the year that we looked at, 2018-19, it was reporting no data at all to the Unfccc as military emissions. So it's a real problem there. The biggest military carbon emitting country is not reporting basic data. And then you can see smaller emissions in the other countries. And the reasons for why France is the biggest, well, it's the largest military. It has a large high levels of high energy consuming vehicles, so warships and fighter planes. It has a high level of international military operations, and it has a large military industrial sector. So even taking account of the fact that it is the electricity sector, for example, is significantly lower carbon than Germany, that still didn't bring it down to a level closer than Germany. So it gives you an idea of just how high France is. And turning to the corporate sector, these are the 5 corporations we found with the largest military-related carbon emissions in the EU. So the largest was PGZ in Poland. This was our estimate. They didn't publish any data, any direct emissions data. So this is our estimate based on indirect data that we were able to access. So this one has a larger uncertainty than the others. But nevertheless, it was still large. It's going to be large in any case. And a key factor of that is energy use in Poland, where Poland has a very high level of carbon emissions for its electricity sector. I think it's something like 80% coal of that order. So that's a big part of those emissions. And then the next biggest, Aerobus, then Leonardo. Aerobus, it's important, I'm particularly looking at Aerobus, which is a company that about 80% of its sales are, or might be a bit lower than that, but a very large fraction of its sales are civilian, makes civilian airliners, that's its main business. Those emissions are not counted in this table. So we've only looked at the emissions related to the arms manufacturer or other military technology manufacturer. So in these tables. So next, I don't think we ended up managing to fit all these figures in the report. We did a little bit of comparison with the UK, and I've just done a bit extra now just for this talk, just to give you a flavour of both reports that SGR has been involved in, looking at the UK and the EU military emissions. So you can see that Britain's carbon footprint is about 30% higher than France, the largest EU country. So bet you're glad about Brexit now. And then BAE Systems as a direct carbon emitter in the military technology sector, that's bigger than PGZ, so it's about 20% emissions higher than the largest military emitting country in the EU. And if you look at taking one indicator, looking at military carbon emissions, military carbon footprint per head of population, and comparing the UK with Germany, for example, you see that the UK emits about 3 times as much as Germany. So it gives you an idea of both the carbon intensity of the UK military, how much it's used overseas, and the various efficiencies as well. So some recommendations. I mean, these are echoing and expanding on what Lindsay has talked about already. We really must improve the collection and reporting of data in this sector to best practice in civilian sectors. That is essential. Otherwise, it makes it really hard to do any further steps. We need consistency across countries. We need consistency in data reported to the Unfccc, and arguably the EU should be leading in setting those standards so that all countries are encouraged to report much better on their military carbon emissions. And then we have various programs, as Lindsay talked about. The military has various programs to improve their energy efficiency. Some of them are encouraging the use of renewable energy to supply their military bases. Some of them are very obvious and straightforward. Some of them are much more speculative in areas such as synthetic fuels. But one thing that they all have in common is they are all about technology, all about making the military stronger, really. There was a report, the US report, which military energy efficiency report that came out in the US from the Pentagon, which I always like to quote at this point. And its title was Less Fuel, More Fight. And that's the attitude of the military in this area. And I think that's a major problem and a major part of why it's so difficult to reduce emissions in this area. So we need to be considering policy measures that bring in other areas of policy and reduce the sizes of the militaries. So we need to look at the role of arms control and disarmament treaties to restrict and reduce the numbers of military technologies out there, weapons out there. We need to look at changes in military strategy that are less aggressive, and we ultimately need to really look at reductions in military spending and questioning the NATO 2% target at the very least. And international cooperation would be a key factor in that. So just to look at a couple of final points, there are major barriers to progress in this area, and I completely understand them. It's not an easy area to work with. We've looked at these issues for many years. Geopolitical tensions, international arms races are what stop progress in this area. And we're now, I mean, with the latest announcements from the British government, for example, about keen to be a leader in robotic weapons, it is frightening. And we're hearing this from various other governments. This is not going to help anyone. And while we still have the NATO spending targets, that's going to be a major obstacle. And while militaries have this tradition of secrecy, now there are some good reasons for some of this, but expanding it into areas of environmental reporting and action is not helpful at all. So, but there is an opportunity. As Lindsay said right at the start, military officials...
Stuart, we need you to wrap up so we have some time for questions. Thanks.
This is my last slide. So we need military officials already recognize, or many of them do, that climate change is a threat multiplier and will make their job worse, as well as the lives of people around the world. Very much so. And some within the military do recognize the importance of reducing military carbon emissions. So there is a potential for international cooperation to reduce military emissions, both through technology and diplomacy. And we need to pursue both of those to make progress in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much. I think those are extremely important messages, and I really enjoyed also your graphics there that show the kind of discrepancy between reporting and what you conservatively estimate as the real emissions. So thank you very much for that. And I must say that it is not, I mean, I have read the draft report embargoed, and it was already a worry, but when you see this, you know, and the kind of strategy that the military is also applying here, it doesn't reassure us more. Less fuel, more fight. I mean, it cannot get more blunt than that in terms of seeing how big the problem is. So now we have some time for questions and answers, and we have a colleague from Swedish Association for you correct me for this English name, Tilda Wendefors, Swedish Association for Peace, and I will give you first the floor because you have done a study similar, but not using the exact same methodology, obviously, as our researchers here. So Tilda, are you with us? Are you ready to go and to take the floor? Tilda Wendefors, I can't hear you if you are here.
Give me 1 second and I'll try and see if I can do something from my side. But also in the meantime, there's also questions in the Q&A that are written out, which the researchers can have a look at. So Tilda, you should be able to speak now.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me now?
Great.
Yes, we do, Tilda.
Perfect.
Please
Great.
welcome. We
Thank
can't
so
see you
much.
though.
Okay, I don't know if I could switch on my camera. I don't have that possibility as a viewer, I think. So
Now we lost you, Tilda. The sound disappeared, at least for me. This is our life now, with little technical problems every time
Yeah,
we
it should be
try to do this.
enabled now. So can you speak,
Yeah.
Tilda?
Tilda, we still can't hear you. Maybe try to reconnect if it's a problem, and we can move to the there. Now we see you even.
yeah.
Yes. Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Please, Tilda.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the digital setting here. It was really interesting to listen to your report and presentation, so thank you for that. My name is Tilda, and I'm the project leader in disarmament questions at the Swedish NGO, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society. And we also recently did a report on Swedish Armed Forces greenhouse emission. And our report revealed, among other things, some major shortcomings regarding carbon reporting and the transparency. So very similar issues that you have been raising here today. Sweden is increasing its military expenditure with 40% in the next coming years, in 2021 to 2025. So it's a really a topic that is important, and we're also scaling up the sector. And one of our recommendations to the Swedish government is that they should carry out in-depth investigation of the Swedish defense sector's total impact on global warming. Leading to my question, like, this inquiry should then cover all activities on the defense sector, including its arms industry and other countries' military training activities within Sweden. So I wonder if you know if any other country have done this kind of overview, and if there is some kind of general structure or standard that this overview should have, and you as a group recommend when we push this demand on a national level. Thank you.
Can I answer that one?
We have a. Yeah, I think the best thing actually would be if we do the questions, the answers at the end, just because I can see quite a few coming in. I'll just read out quickly these questions in the chat, and then I see hands raised by Sandra Pereira, Idoia Villanueva, and I think Claire Daly had her hand up as well. But anyone else, there's a hand function, and if you can't do that, just write in the Q&A and we can try and give you the floor. But in the Q&A we have from John Cooper here on military emissions reporting. Does the exclusion of military emissions mean global figures on climate change and reduction in carbon emissions are majorly out or not? So Stuart will answer that, and he'll answer all of them actually. And how can national campaign groups in France, for example, connect with your work and work with you to campaign? That's from Holly Spencer. And from Fiona McCohen, what can we do as ordinary citizens to get better reporting in the UK and in Europe? So quite a few questions coming in. So yeah. Malin, if you want to give the floor to one of the people there.
Yes, thank you for reading those out, Damien. I suggest to Stuart and Lindsay that we also take maybe the questions and maybe the input from our other members of parliament, so that you can take them with you also when you answer. So Damien, you said that Sandra Pereira from Portugal is here. Sandra, please take the floor. We try to keep it short because then we have also another colleague, Idoia, that wants to come in. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Malin. I want to thank you for the presentation and for the study. And at some point in the study, you referred to abandoned military sites. In Portugal, we have an old American military base in Azores, and 60 years after the American leaving it, the infrastructures are still there, and the soil and the water decontamination required by the people has not yet been carried out. In your studies, do you consider deepening these issues, even taking into account the health of the populations? Do you know if environmental impact studies are required before, for instance, NATO is authorized to set up its military bases around the world? Do you believe that improving the environmental performance of our machinery is enough to actually reduce the impact on the environment of military operations? And another question is the war industry, with investment in the increasingly modern weapons, and with the massive lethal effects, can destroy entire parts of the planet in one day. Isn't it ironic for the European Union to apparently make its policies environmentally friendly and at the same time to invest more and more in the industry that only destroys? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Now I give the floor to our colleague from Spain, Idoia Villanueva Ruiz. Good to see you. Hello, Idoia, please.
Igualmente, I would like to advise that we have translation in Spanish. There is an option for the traduction in Spanish. I'm going to check. Lo primero, muchísimas gracias, Malin, y a los autores y al staff del UE por un informe que creo que es fundamental, ¿no? Sabemos cómo el Parlamento Europeo declaró en noviembre de 2019 la emergencia climática y, sin embargo, pues vemos todavía pocas acciones al respecto, ¿no? Una acción climática que está teniendo, bueno, impacto en la manera de relacionarnos, en la agricultura, en nuestra soberanía alimentaria, en el uso de los recursos, y muchas veces se pone el foco en la responsabilidad individual y sabemos bien que necesitamos ir a la raíz del propio sistema y fundamentalmente a sectores muchas veces olvidados como este, ¿no? Que están lejos de ser sometidos al escrutinio público. Creo que nos da información muy útil y que es muy de agradecer. Impresiona, ¿no? que la huella de carbono en gasto militar se estima en 25 millones de toneladas de CO2. Creo que es impresionante, pero me llama también mucho la atención el escándalo que supone la falta de transparencia y la exactitud de los informes sobre las emisiones de efecto invernadero por parte precisamente de estos sectores militares. Me gustaría entender si a lo largo de este estudio habéis encontrado algún tipo de legislación común en la que poder agarrarnos para poder pedir mayor transparencia, evidente y necesaria, pero para poder solicitar y pedir en los diferentes países de la Unión Europea. Es evidente que ni la lucha contra el cambio climático ni la acción exterior va de la mano en la Unión Europea, que necesitamos un cambio también en esa acción exterior para poder luchar contra el cambio climático y desde luego volver a daros las gracias porque estoy segura de que vamos a poder utilizar en iniciativas mucho este informe. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Idoia. And I don't know, Damien, you flagged to me if somebody else has asked for the floor. No?
I can't see any other hands up. Okay. And in the Q&A, we just have some other questions, but I won't read them out. So,
okay, because I think it seems like Stuart and Lindsay have access to the Q&A, so you can see look a little bit there and respond to. Do your best to respond to all these kind of both some of these questions very specific and others very broad in terms of what are we going from here and to decarbonization and demilitarization. So I don't know in which order you would like to speak. I will give you 5 minutes each before we then kind of maybe try to wrap up. Would you like to go first, Stuart, or?
Yeah, I'll go first. Right, there's quite a few things there. I think I'll start with John Cooper's question, because he was asking about what does the exclusion of military emissions mean for global figures on climate change? Basically, it's hard to be sure because there are so many gaps in the data. In countries like Russia and China, there's no data at all. I came up with an estimate a couple of years ago where I reckoned it was about 5% of global carbon emissions were probably military related. Since that time, I've looked in detail at more figures, and I thought maybe it's a bit lower than that, possibly 3 or 4%. But as I say, when you don't even have an estimate for somewhere like China, which is a very carbon intensive country, and a large military, then it could easily be 5% again. And that estimate doesn't include battlefield related emissions. So if fuel dumps are destroyed and go up in flames, post-construction, post-conflict reconstruction, healthcare for veteran survivors of warfare, all those things are not included in these estimates. So yeah, we're looking several percent above where emissions are at the moment due to the military activities. To try and answer a couple of the others around reporting standards, Tilda's question was asking about tips on what reporting standards to ask for. I mean, there's something called the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Protocol, which is a standard reporting framework based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is, the advisory body to the UN on this issue. There is a subsidiary body which produces standards which are used by organizations. These are used by public bodies like the military. They are used by private bodies like companies. Companies that report well, and there are quite a few civilian companies who do this now, do it very thoroughly. Arms companies, military technology companies, some of them are starting to. So we did find a couple of ones who are starting to report reasonably. Militaries are still a long way back. I mean, interestingly, Britain is one of the better ones. That's why we were able to find as much data on there. And they've been reporting for quite a while, but that doesn't excuse them having such large military carbon emissions. And their efforts to reduce them are, well, patchy at best. And it's, of course, the problem is basically, it depends what base year you use. If you use a base year when you're having a war and then your emissions reduce because you bring your troops home, then that really doesn't show that you're demilitarizing if you're ready to do it again whenever things happen, whenever a new crisis emerges. The report, so we need better reporting standards from the Unfccc. That needs concerted effort. I think we could do with a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change directly on military carbon emissions, because they have not looked at this area at all. And if you look at their reports, military carbon emissions virtually doesn't get a mention. They do 1,000-page reports that are the Bible of climate science, and they barely mention this sector. And yet it's as big as various other industrial sectors or parts of aviation. Let's just try to look through some of the other questions as well. How can campaigners, sorry, I've just got to unplug the phone.
We have too many machines. There are still even analog machines, I hear.
I'm sorry, I normally don't sit in an office with a phone.
Welcome back,
I can't unplug. So campaigning groups and citizens, I mean, it's environmental groups are often scared of taking on this issue because it means challenging the military. And peace groups have started to take on this issue, but environmental groups haven't. And I really encourage environmental groups to start talking about this issue. It is a sizable proportion, several percent of national emissions. So do take notice of these, do include this in your campaigning, highlight it. And of course, as other sectors reduce their carbon emissions, civilian sectors reduce their carbon emissions, if the military is failing to do that, it's going to become a bigger and bigger proportion. So that's important. Just even to look at the figures from our report, from our website, and use them in your campaigning is important. And ask these questions of your decision makers.
Thank you, Stuart. I will hand over to Lindsay for answering some questions and some conclusions from your side, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, there was a host of questions that Sandra made as well, and I just wanted to touch on one of those that she asked about land quality and contaminated sites, which is obviously something that we didn't cover in this. Although we did touch upon the size of the military estate, which would could be used as, with respect to the biodiversity improvements, about using that for renewable energy generation as well. But on the point about land quality, because of the size of the military estate, then yes, this is potentially a big problem, which would be a fantastic thing to be able to look into much more detail across the EU. I know with respect to on the UK side of things, they've been looking at the legacy of contaminated land for a number of years now. And with respect to how that's addressed, there is obviously carbon emission issues there as to what kind, if it is remediated, how is that done, whether it's done in a sustainable way, using whether that's through bioremediation systems or the low carbon technologies, because there's obviously a way that can be done with lower emissions.
Thank you very much. Anything else you want to address, Lindsay?
I just wanted to say this is much further down the line as well, but we did touch in the report about the usefulness of having independent verification as well of reports as well, but recognise that is much further down the line when we get the reporting rolled out across the militaries, and then having that independently verified.
Yeah, we can see that in many sectors that if we don't also have some access for independent monitoring bodies or mechanisms of some sorts, it's usually, especially in these sectors that are so secretive in their core, it doesn't really work. So with that, I will now give the floor to my colleague working also in the Committee on Environment in the European Parliament, Mick Wallace. We can hardly see you with the camera there, Mick. Come in the, turn on the light. Turn on the light.
Maybe I should turn on the light.
You have time
anyway,
to turn
listen.
on the light. And then I will come back. We have some words from Mick, and then I will come back and close the seminar. Okay, here you go, Mick. Please.
Okay. Thanks very much, Marlon. And I'd just like to thank Stuart and Lindsay for their great work. And listen, we've been aware of them in the past, and they've been around on the scene for a while. And without a shadow of a doubt, this whole area is not highlighted enough, and that's a big problem for us. It's bad enough, as Stuart has pointed out, that there's a serious element of secrecy just about around everything to do with the military anyway, and the fact that France can actually get away with not even reporting any of their carbon footprint to the UN it just emphasizes the kind of problems we face. But I suppose where we go from here it's a big challenge, and the points that you laid out, around improving data collection and all, and the reporting of data on military carbon emissions, it's going to be difficult to force member states and institutions to actually go to that space, given that we're having such a problem in everything to do with military. And Stuart made the point as well that many green groups, environmental groups, don't really want to go to the space of challenging what the military do. I mean, for example, last year there was MRV shipping debates going on in here, and looking at the regulation, and there was amendments being put into it and all, but we tried to get military ships incorporated in the regulation so that they too would be held responsible for their emissions and for their environmental discrepancies. But in actual fact, they have an exemption. And now you would say, well, how in God's name are they entitled to an exemption? But I mean, they're the challenges that we're dealing with. I mean, you outlined the arms control, reduction in military spending, changing the military strategy as key elements, and I think that's very true. But we know that, for example, on arms control, like there's 8 member states sold arms to Saudis and UAE in the last couple of years, and they were being used to engage in collective punishment against the people of Yemen, which actually broke the EU's own arms sales and control rules. So they're actually capable of just totally ignoring their own rules. And we're aware of the fact that many of the international law regulations are being completely ignored now with the illegal use of sanctions, the time that we're interfering in the sovereignty of other nations, completely flouting international law in the process. So obviously getting on top of this is a massive problem. So how do we do it? Well, I mean, I suppose I'm a believer in people power. I've never believed that politicians change much. And I think that our best contribution has to be informing the public more about what's happening in terms of the environmental problem related to military and the complete madness of the increased militarization of Europe that's going on. And as someone highlighted there, I mean, the Swedish Parliament voted to increase military spending in the next 5 years by 40% only in December. I mean, that's kind of scary. And I mean, your report highlighted that on average, it's over. The increase since 2014 has been over 25%. Well, the increase on spending on anything else probably hasn't matched that. It hasn't, certainly in health or housing anyway. And I mean, that's a big problem for us. But I think that the public are not as informed as they should be around these issues. And because the politicians are doing things that are in their name that the people wouldn't want them to do. And I think that's our biggest challenge. The people of Europe want peace, not war. They want the environmental challenges dealt with. They don't want what's happening that you've exposed. And the stronger of a message that we can get to the public. And as a challenge, we don't have the help of mainstream media, who are part of the problem rather than the solution. So we've got to find ways of informing our citizens a lot better. And thanks again for everyone that took part. It's really important that we talk more about all these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Mick. And I will have the pleasure to close this meeting, but in a way to say that I think we are embarking and we will continue this work together. And it's very clear that for us, your recommendations in terms that Mick also concluded with to address the bigger picture of this arms race that we're in a lack of let's say that we are being dominated by the military strategy that is not fit for for purpose, and that we are in a paradigm always of security, and maybe we should be in a paradigm of peace instead, and that's not exactly the same thing always. So I think one of the most, it was one in the chat here, questions or more of an input on that we should reject the PESCO, which is the arms and military cooperation at EU level, the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Agency, and this is a part of the left's program in the EU Parliament and our parties in the member states to reject this militarization, what we now see of the EU. So that's and here it comes also PESCO, but also NATO. Yeah, I come from a country where we have luckily so far rejected to be members of NATO, and I think it's a very, very important peace strategy to stay out of NATO, as it's part of a barrier when this organization asks you to arm, which is also what the EU is doing now, asking member states to arm themselves. The call upon environmental organizations, climate organizations, climate justice organizations to involve in this issue of trying to address the military and its impact on the environment and climate, I think is a very important call. We are trying to do this in the European Parliament. We, the MEPs that took initiative here, we come from the Committee on Environment. We want to make this, we will do our best to make a meeting space between peace organizations and environmental and climate organizations. And hopefully we will be able to meet even in real life, so that we can actually make these connections between different organizations and between you who did this study for us. So we commit to that. And we also commit, as you've heard, our different colleagues, MEPs from different countries, to be at the political level, to take this message forward and to do what we can within our settings to make this, to put the spotlight on the military sector in terms of climate issues also. So with that, I just also want to invite everyone to download the report, Under the Radar: Carbon Footprint of Europe's Military Sectors. And I also, of course, want to again thank our researchers, Stuart and Lindsay, who are with us today, and your teams around you, possibly. I want to thank our team, and especially Damien Thompson, that has been coordinating this from our side. And with that, to say that this is one step, we will take further steps. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.